Welcome to the studio. My name is Mark Chillingworth. This discussion is about the disruptive workforce. Can I start the debate and talk about, have you seen your teams evolve, the way they work, the methods they use today over the last 5 years? Has there been a significant amount of change?
So I was thinking, what did my team actually look like 5 years ago? And 5 years ago I was taking up the CIO role for control risk, so it was a new role for me as well. One of the things that really stood out was the fact that the teams were still operating in silos. So the dev team were working very closely together, but not so much with the service delivery teams. And communication was still a problem. Even though we were a global company, we have to learn how to communicate globally. It just wasn't at the right level. So what I saw was that we were missing a lack of diversity, a lack of good communication, a lack of team working. After some mistakes to try and fix that, we realized what we actually had to do to get the team to work together was to take down those silos and to operate more in a project perspective, a product perspective, rather than the siloed functional teams. But I think the biggest change we made was around bringing in more females to the IT team, because at the time when I joined, I think we had 4 women and 1 was on the way out. So not exactly a very diverse team. But the problem with bringing women into the IT team was attracting them. So we knew we had to look at things like flexible working. We had to ensure that actually the working parents in the team, not just the females, had an equal opportunity to pick up their kids from school or drop them off. So we made a real effort to make that work. And now the split is 46% female, which is huge, a huge change. And I really think that's because we made such a big effort to make that happen. So as a result, actually the teams communicate really well now because we've sprinkled in different styles. And it's not just about working on your own. We've brought in new tools. So obviously we had Skype, but we brought in Slack, which the dev teams really enjoyed using, the project managers enjoyed using. And now we're using Teams, which is starting to spread throughout the business. So big difference from where we were.
And I think to add to that, one of the things that we noticed, technology leaders are part of the problem here. We have lots of tools. You mentioned Slack, we had Skype, we had Teams, we had Cisco's WebEx. The interoperability across the different technology stacks has actually made it harder to actually create that right environment for our people. Yeah. So I think one of the things I'd like to see is a more open environment where these different technologies can actually cooperate and collaborate easier together, because we've seen the introduction of risk with opening of the environments. So sharing of sensitive data on Slack by the developers around the world is a real problem. So how do we create the right control environment while still providing the right flexibility to our workforce is a real challenge.
I think it's a case of kind of same but different for me. So in many ways, if you walk into a big corporation today, it doesn't look a lot different to how many of them. I mean, I think people trying to do stuff differently are visibly different, but they are still, unfortunately, a minority. I think we've still got it's too much of a male-dominated industry. The technologies, as you were saying, the technologies have allowed us to do more. So there's more remote working, there's more ability to do that. We're still learning our way. And I think that's one of the problems we're going to have to face. I don't know how many around the table people start, every conference call starts with 10 minutes of sorting out the technology. And it massively frustrates me because we work in technology and yet it's still, what are we using, how's it work? It's crazy. That stuff just needs to go away, because while that's there, you still obsess about it. And as a technology leader, the last thing I want to do is, you're around a table, there's a bunch of other people from around the business, they look at you, they say, why is this? But you think, but so there's some things, it feels like we're very immature in those areas. And we've got to get over those hurdles to really be productive.
Yeah, if I could jump in, Shure is manufacturer of audio equipment, and much of it is geared towards conferencing. And what you just mentioned, where it takes 10 minutes to make sure that everything is working, and can you hear me? Oh, your mic's muted. Oh, even at Shure, we have that problem, and we recognize that. And I think part of what you discussed as well is just having flexible work environments and having those spaces where an employee can work anywhere in the world. If you still don't have a communication system that works correctly, works well, works constantly, you can't hear anybody, it's all for naught. But Some of the changes in the last 5 years absolutely has to do with the amount of talent that you want to find that maybe isn't centralized to your home headquarters, right? So now we can look for talent all over the world because we have these tools.
And you mentioned flexibility. Andy, I want to ask you about this because you've probably studied this a lot. How are organisations coping with flexibility? Are some of them finding it a bit of a challenge to cope with the fact that the workforce has all sorts of different time zones, effectively, of people's needs and demands?
Yeah, so obviously we're a global organisation, 500,000 people nearly, 200 odd cities around the world. We work on client sites a lot, and yet we work in strongly distributed, connected teams, and we've had to work heavily on both the infrastructure around that and the behaviours. Actually, the behaviours, probably matter even more. When you get the technology working right, you still need to activate that set of behaviours within global teams. But I think flexibility is a much bigger topic than just where and when work happens. You look at you look at the UK workforce or globally, there's a huge demand from people to work flexibly, and that's more than just working hours or contract types. It's things like, what form of work do I want to do? Do I want to be an employee? The kind of idea of an employee kind of only goes back a couple of centuries. The idea of being a worker goes back much, much longer than that. And we've got this proliferation of different types of work happening now, particularly in the US economy and now in Europe as well. So kind of gig working, freelancing, etc. Working in an ecosystem. So actually the people doing the work inside the organisation aren't necessarily just your employees. And I think that desire for flexibility from people, a lot of that's about well-being, but it's also about, back to the topic of diversity, about allowing different types of people to work within the organisation. So, if people are part-time or full-time carers, how can they blend paid work in there? Or if you've got working parents in the workforce, how are you creating an environment that's flexible enough for them to work with you? But it's also kind of one of those topics where it's kind of good for people, but good for business as well, because we're here in London at the moment, in the middle of London, where the real estate costs are huge. Managing footprint of sites, managing productivity of teams, and this thing about kind of having a more motivated workforce because of flexibilities. Those are kind of good for people and good for business, but it's not a one-size-fits-all thing.
And many of you have touched on this sort of the battle for talent, the skills gap. They've been headline news for 2-3 years now. How does changing the way your organisation goes to work or does work, how is that improving, helping your organisations win that battle for talent or retain the teams you need?
I don't think you can hire the younger generation, the millennials, if you don't offer flexibility. That's what they're demanding. They're demanding not just remote working, but the ability to work on lots of different things. The days of keeping someone, in your company for more than 2 years are unfortunately gone, unless you offer that wide range of tasks they can get their hands on and not just sticking them in one role. But they need flexibility in terms of their hours as well. So I think that's quite important. And I think if you really acknowledge the fact that the world is changing, that the corporate culture really isn't that attractive to the younger generation anymore. And to be honest, it's probably not that attractive to our generation either. Things like very rigid performance reviews and this 9-to-5 working culture. If we're really honest, do we enjoy that? Maybe some people, but I don't. So I think it's time that the younger generation are demanding that change, but actually it's time.
And Andy, if I could come to you, your organisation has a very different workforce. You're not all office based. You've got very customer centric people working all sorts of shifts. How is this sort of flexible working helping those people who don't do the 9-to-5 but actually have to be customer serving 24/7 almost?
Well, I think most companies have that issue somewhere in their workforce. They've got people who are shift-based or working in different ways. I think increasingly the availability of good technology to enable those things and make things easy for people so that actually they can communicate well, they don't feel left out. When you've got a distributed workforce like we have, so in hotels and restaurants, that you can keep in touch with people. I think that's super important because people want to feel related to the company they work for. And I think to pick up on the point earlier, increasingly these days, I think what people are after is a purpose. They want to join or do, if they are going to join a company, and I'd agree with the fact that younger people especially are less prone to that. But if you are going to join a company, you want to know why you're doing it. And to be able to relay that purpose, be able to give people a sense of why they're spending their time here, I think it's going to become really important. That sort of transparency of what we do, why we do it, how we do it, all of those things will be really important for the workforce of the future.
Bringing it back to being technology leaders, we touched on some of the challenges around conference calls and what have you. What capabilities and technology skills do you believe are going to become vital to your teams and therefore vital to your organisations and change again the way people work?
We're looking at how do we create an integrated architect. Architecture is so complicated these days. You've got a security lens, you've got a pure technology lens, and there's many technology disciplines these days. If you open that, bit like a house builder, you've got a joiner, electrician, etc. I think we're looking to see, can we skill up our architects to be multidisciplined, because the world is moving at such a pace. Our architects are struggling to keep up, and that's a real challenge that we're finding. And I go back to the question is, where are these guys getting their education and their training from? And I'm really looking to the universities of the world to actually provide those skills at a much younger age, because the best architects I've got are near the retirement, at the wrong end of the spectrum. And I can't wait until architects are in their 40s and 50s until they've got all the skills. I need the gig economy coming through with some of those inherent skills from the get-go.
I think that's a really big challenge, is finding the right tech skills with also the right competencies and the ability to collaborate. That's really important, because a technical architect that can't explain their wonderful ideas is not very useful. I think we have an obligation also to upskill the workforce, including the technology team, absolutely, because technology is changing so quickly now. For example, when we moved to Azure, that was probably 5 years ago, and it took us an incredibly long time to get our architects and our engineers up to the right level. And I think we learned from that. But now, looking across the wider business, it's no good if we have all this technology they can't use. We now need to upskill the business. I'm sure you have a lot more to say about that.
Personally, we've been through a massive transformation at Accenture. We've moved 60% of our business to cloud security and digital. Back to that 5 years question, we've doubled the size of the workforce in that 5 years. We're nearly 500,000 people. But we've not hired our way through that. Most of that's been new skilling. So where we're saving money through AI and robotics, we're reinvesting most of that save back in new skilling. So actually we're being very deliberate about, we need to build the skills of the future. And some of that's been very top-down deliberate, like building a digital business, building a security business, building an analytics business. And of course there's been seed hiring into those. But then actually, how do you take a historic base of 350,000 technologists who would have been like a Java specialist 5 years ago, how do you take them through that new skilling journey? And really interestingly, most of that's been done through our business. Yes, we've had a very clear top-down plan about the workforce plan needs to back up the business strategy, but we've then very much kind of empowered the business to make that happen. So we get around 50 million learning events now a year through our learning experience platform. So like one every other day for people. And it's people in the business that are owning the content in those learning boards and managing that new skilling journey for their people.
And the title of this discussion is The Disruptive Workforce. Has that journey of taking the core of your existing business and reskilling them been less disruptive but enabled you to keep being a business that changes?
Yeah, but I think it's also actually helped the workforce be the disruptor, rather than, it's not about the business impacting our people, but actually our people quite often taking ownership of that change themselves. Either at an individual level, I want to select into taking on different work. So for example, our India operations team, in 1 year we had 17,000 people who were largely doing kind of data processing type jobs, put their hands up to say, actually, large parts of my job, not all, but there's large parts of my job we can get rid of using robotics process automation technologies or bits of machine learning. Like the handshake with them was, if you're doing that, we'll put you through a new skilling path into working on analytics or insights type technologies. So additional client value service. And good for the individual because they got progression in the firm and they got surety about the future.
And outside of India, did people embrace that process?
Yeah.
Because I would appreciate the Indians are constantly wanting to learn, but traditionally I've found Western individuals who are more focused on wanting to keep their skills, trying to retrain a Java programmer, can be quite a difficult activity.
Yeah. We've kind of had to reactivate the learning culture. So there's, the sort of content provided by 4,000 learning boards. They have curators in the business, but also getting the whole kind of 500,000 people learning properly again all the time has been a key part of the last 5 years for us.
And how have you done that? What can we learn from techniques that if you could share?
What can you nick? So I think the big thing has been starting a conversation with people. So actually being deliberate about where is the business going. So we've had a conversation internally around what the wise pivot of the business is. So this idea about we are moving the business into these areas, and that's been very clear internally about where that's going. But then dropping that down to a level that people can individually engage with and go, okay, do I want to buy into one of those things for the future? Actually, am I going to start to invest some time in it? And that's been very much, as all these good things are, lots of good local conversations with leadership through the organisation. Some really strong top-down leadership. Late COPN on term. We've got Julie Sweet, our new CEO, Ellen Shook, who's our Chief HR Officer. Like really, really strong leadership at the top who get this idea about more digital and more human at the same time. But then actually it's about leaders who know the folks on the ground, having the conversation about, okay, this is actually happening. Are you getting on board with the journey or not? Here's the things that are actually available to help you. Yeah.
It's an interesting point that I think that you touched on there about being more human. IT and technology has been an industry that has been incredibly inwardly focused during almost its entire period, and here we are just as we're approaching 2020, and finally, that's not going to be the case. The last 30 years of my career has been about people worrying about boxes and wires and data centers and business software and lines of code. Today, no one worries about that anymore, right? I mean, what you worry about is how is technology going to affect people or affect products. And that ability to have people in your team who can empathise, who think about customer experience, have a slightly more human view of the world, I think in 5 years' time, that's going to be much more important than can they program Java, which you can teach them, but you cannot teach someone to light up the sort of empathy gene if you haven't got it. So I think that's going to be a seismic change for technology as a whole, because we're just not used to that. We've had 50 years of people who were where they are because they're good at ones and zeros.
It sounds like culture, though. Organisations have always done change to people, not with people, and technology has been part of that. But it sounds like we're moving much more to a world, hopefully, of changing with people. And it sounds like you've been on that experimentation of working on it. Anybody agree, disagree with that?
Agree with that completely. I did want to touch on something earlier about collaboration. As I was thinking about attracting talent and keeping talent, oftentimes the collaboration tools could be a reason why they enjoy or don't enjoy their work, right? We talked about flexible work and all that stuff, but the technology needs to change as well to where, for example, you walk into a room, you don't have to fiddle with all the technology to get a collaboration call working or any kind of conference call working. And it's attractive to a younger generation, I think, to come into an advanced type of environment in an office or a home office where, yeah, that's cool, this is a great collaboration tool that I could use. If they go into an old school kind of, there's a speakerphone on a desk and, no video conferencing, they'll be like, what did I walk into? So I think it's important that the technology changes to be much easier to use or automatic. And of course, we could talk about machine learning and AI and all that stuff is related. But the IT side of the business also, to your point, needs to understand the human aspect of it and not looking at putting barriers in place of people communicating, right? We need to make sure that the IT folks understand that collaboration is absolutely imperative to move everything forward. And then the last piece of that, I would say, is kind of the you can't fix stupid thing. If you are in a meeting and you're collaborating and you don't unmute your mic, for example, or your camera's on and you don't realize it and you're sitting in your underwear, these aren't, you can't fix that, but these are some of the things that I think we might talk about training a little bit later, but we don't do a good job of training people how to use the technology that's there, and we don't do a good job of keeping up with the technology that is coming very quickly.
You raise a good point there with training, isn't it? Is that training is generally decreasing, but at the same time, when you meet this next generation of workforce, they just seem to train themselves, experiment more. That must be a challenge as business technology leaders as to how much do you invest in training when at the same time many of your people will probably be, certainly they'll be ahead of me, ahead of you sometimes on their adoption and their understanding of how technologies work.
I think from my learning, training is a bit isolated at times where we send individuals on training courses. And I think a lot of this actually it's little investment needed, because it's practice we need, not training. Actually getting the teams to work together and practice the meetings in a virtualized environment. And I don't think we spend enough time internally in looking at that aspect. To your point, there's a huge element that we can just self-teach each other, talk to each other, go through the environments, give people the feedback. And some of the training is a bit, send somebody on a training course or send them on a management development program, and they're there by themselves. Some companies are better at that, at doing that as teams. But in terms of the flexible workforce, I've said to my guys, we need to start practicing some of these meetings. Great sports teams get good at practicing together.
Over and over again. And just to bring that to life, a couple of sort of applied examples, or pick a couple of banks that are nice comparisons. One was a top leadership team, and they were going through that kind of how do we collaborate better together and out into the organisation. What really helped? Reverse mentoring. Just having someone who's, like they talk about native on this, like absolutely native in this sort of, how do you do this externally? All the dumb questions that I could never ask a peer or someone from HR, actually they could ask the 20-year-old in the organisation. That really, really helped that senior leadership team through that journey. And like you said, then it's practice and starting somewhere. Yeah. Another one would be kind of like a big US bank. Different challenge. They were going through the kind of enterprise collaboration sort of things Jim was just talking about. Actually finding out how it was going to change the work that the teams did was a real challenge. I think that kind of goes back to your point about, we need to design technology with empathy, with experience in mind, right? Well, how's this making this team in credit risk or this team in distribution more effective in the work they do? How does it connect them to the information they need or to the expert they need? How does it make their day-to-day work easier? And then actually, you're right, then it's just people you're driving the car downhill, then it's easy. Because actually you've got something that people want to use rather than just a tool, and they're going, well, how does that relate to my stuff?
I love the idea of sandboxing meetings and conferences and that. Yeah. But we do it with the technology. It's a good point, isn't it? Why don't we do it with the organisation?
Yeah. Well, run behavioural experiments, right?
Yeah.
We do it brilliantly. Crisis management. We run exercises every quarter on crisis management. So we're prepared when should unfortunately that event happen. We don't do it with other parts of our day-to-day lives in the work environment. And I'm like, why not? Why not? Let's just do that and make it safe for people so people can speak up. When you then start looking at global organisations across cultures, that gets even harder. Really does get harder. Then time zones, and are we respectful of people across different time zones and different cultures? And it adds just more complexity to that flexible, operating model that we're trying to create.
I think the old school method of training, when you sit in a classroom or it takes hours and hours, that isn't working anymore. What we recently started doing is very quick 15-minute sessions where we pick a topic based on the things the business are raising or something we think they need to know, and we just do a wide Skype, talk to them about what it is, get their feedback, and then that's it. So they actually have time to go, and it's focused on one specific area.
It's funny how people get stuck on stuff, isn't it? We had some things last year where we were doing some learning development, and people were writing the courses. And I said, why don't you just film someone doing it and just put a 2-minute video up, And it's almost like we haven't got used to the technology we've got at our fingertips now. Someone filming and just talking through how you fill a form in or whatever the piece of software was takes 2 minutes. Someone sitting writing all this stuff and printing it up takes hours. So we haven't got used to this stuff ourselves. I mean, it's waiting to all be disrupted, I'm sure.
And you see that with what's happened, YouTube's biggest use now is how-to, isn't it?
Yeah.
How do I unblock the sink or anything?
It's my saviour.
Exactly.
It's my DIY saviour.
All those DIY skills are there. Yeah.
Well, we started bringing some of our apprentices into some of our meetings and events for them to give us, just to sit there and to give us their feedback. The feedback is just fascinating when they're looking and going, why do you do such things, crazy things, like taking minutes. Why are you taking minutes? Why aren't you recording the meeting and get the recording to actually automate the production of the minutes? They've just got a completely different...
I'm the sponsor of our grad program in IT in Whitbread, and it's what we encourage the grads have. They have a mentor, but they reverse mentor one of the leadership team, and it's great because they're given the space and the authority, if you like, to question stuff and constantly ask, and they're always full of. It's just the best thing. I can't recommend that highly enough.
And also look at the universities. They're totally changing how they deliver education. So they kind of push to do the online training, the online courses. For example, I recently did a data science course through the EDX platform in the US. And it was videos, chat, textbook stuff, but it was a good mixture. And actually I prefer that, because then I can just go on whenever I have the time, rather than sitting in a classroom, which I really don't want to do and I don't have the time for.
On top of your day job and your
Yeah.
other commitments. Yeah. We've touched on it briefly, but what are the skills you think your organisations are going to absolutely require? It sounds like empathy is one, but are there technical, are there business, and are there personal skills that you still, when you look across your organisations, think I've got gaps here and I want to fill those?
I think customer experience, that idea about understanding journeys, understanding and how business architecture and journeys come together to create brilliant products or brilliant experiences or brilliant services, that stuff is still hard to say. Is that an IT skill? Is business architecture an IT skill? So traditionally that would be business analysis or something like that, but increasingly that's also incorporates process mapping. All of these things, do they belong in IT? I don't know whether that's the answer, but that piece of how do you make this more efficient? How do you continually look at your products, your process, your services, and constantly ask, can you do it better? Because again, to my earlier point, we're less worried about what's the thing that's going to do it for you, because you can just buy those now. So how are you going to apply them to be better at whatever you do? That's a skill that's going to come through.
I couldn't agree more. I've come from a logistics supply chain background, and coming into financial services has been quite a culture shock on many different levels. But that continual learning ethos is part of the DNA in the industries I worked in, where it wasn't seen as a criticism, it was actually seen as a key enabler to how can we move the boat faster, or how can we row the boat faster. Trying to bring that into industries where that hasn't necessarily been part of the culture of DNA is been great. We've made some huge progress, but it's hard work convincing people that there is a better way of doing it, and that diverse thinking is critical in that journey.
We've done a lot of work, practical work with clients in this space, but also research with G20 and with WEF recently on kind of the whole new skilling agenda and where it fits with both use of new technologies, but also how technology is changing the underlying nature of work in organisations. We've all seen the Daily Mail headlines about the robots coming to take the jobs away, and there's truth in that. There's plenty of low skill work that is highly automatable. It's around, like, we look at the kind of the US and UK sort of job taxonomies, and you find about 35-40% of work has potential for automation at a task level. It's never typically whole jobs. The kind of big debate on automation is that impacts low skill work much more than it does complex work. So if you're in a highly skilled profession where there's high amounts of judgment and empathy and social skills involved, then there'll be some of your work that goes away, but you're probably going to reinvest that in more time with clients or more time doing the professional task. You'll find people who are more productive, and we talk about that like as a sort of human and machine. I think kind of Robert Downey Jr. in sort of Iron Man sort of thing, rather than the machine's taking away the job. The bit that's concerning for us is about lower skill work where there's higher automation effect, but also those folks who've got less transferable skills, less opportunities to access education, less financial safety net. And so kind of at a national level and international level, how we handle new skilling around automation is really important. And then I think for us inside our organisations, how we really embrace the opportunity to augment work with technology. So we've got humans supporting machines, machines supporting humans, because that's where the real revenue kick is for our companies. Is you can really open up new possibilities about how you serve clients, the markets you serve, when you think about technology that way. Not just how do you minimise the effort inside the work that's done today. Actually, start thinking about let's think about a different value stream for a client or a new market we could serve with this stuff, rather than this is the box of the organisation today, let's make it a bit smaller.
That's an interesting point you raise there about new skilling and on automation. It's a bit of a syntax question, isn't it? And going back to what we were discussing earlier about doing change with people, not to them, is that, as you say, we're automating tasks, not roles, predominantly, and certainly all the interviews I do, that's what I hear. But as you say, the headlines, the hype has got very much around we're going to automate everything.
And there's a lot of experience about saving 1,000 fingernails in the organisation rather than releasing any capacity for actual more work to be done. But if we haven't got a plan and a narrative with the workforce, how on earth are we going to have trust through this journey that we're on? Like,
It's a really good point. I think we're looking at this at the moment in Experian around the ethics of AI and how do we ensure that we've got no unconscious bias creeping in, and how do we give that complete transparency to the consumer. And it's a real challenge, and we haven't cracked it fully yet.
It is a real challenge because the bias is already built in. So it's about figuring out where that bias is.
Yeah. But if we're not careful, I think regulation is going to come in very quickly. Certainly with the massive explosion of Internet of Things in the next 5 years, with 5G coming into our space. We're going to go from 26 billion rough devices to 75 billion in 3 to 5 years. We'll need ML and AI within our world just to cope with the sheer amount of data to process. So it's going to be a huge topic, I think, in the next 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, I think more has to be done at the primary school and secondary school level. If you look at the curriculum today, is it really geared up for the future? That's the kind of thing that actually worries me more than resolving those issues in the workforce, although it's a major challenge. We recognize it's a challenge and we're going to try and tackle it for the most part, but I'm not sure that's being tackled at the school level yet.
I agree. I think the educational system's got a long way to go, but the corporate response is insufficient at the moment. So there's about 2/3 of people who believe new skilling around new technologies is important. This is the whole workforce, not just the technology workforce. Sort of 85% of them feel confident that they're going to be able to make that journey. So you've got much greater level of buy-in to this journey than people think top down. The workforce is ready to go on this. It's only 3% of organisations have significantly uplifted their new skilling spend. So you've got a real need, a real kind of social need, and a good economic case for it. And yet we've still got learning stuck in L&D inside HR, when actually it's kind of a core enabler of business transformation. Actually, it's something that people need now.
When we're talking about kind of the skill sets that you look for new folks coming in, I think flexibility is the one thing that comes to mind. But related to that, I think it's about listening to the younger people coming into an organization. For example, I had a conversation with one of those millennials, and and I was just asking her about what do you think about the collaboration tools that we use at our company, and she mentioned something about Skype is fine and all, but we really prefer Slack. I'm like, okay, I don't know really what Slack is, but why? Like, well, it's more, you could personalize it more. I'm like, okay, well, that's not anything I would really care about, but very, very quickly, I think, the new generation coming into the workforce, they're going to be much more technically savvy, I think, as users than we will be. And it seems like a blink of an eye that I lost, touch with kind of the technology, but they are well versed, and we should listen to that as they bring those ideas and technical skills to our companies.
It's because they've got choice now, though. I mean, I think you wind back the clock 10 years, you didn't, you used the tool your company gave you.
Yeah.
Because there wasn't a choice. You couldn't go out and get a Slack. You couldn't go and sign up. So now you've got a generation of people who are saying, if I don't like this, I'll get these 3 other things in any part of their life. So if you come up and say you're going to use this thing because this is what they say, I don't like it. I don't like that colour. I want this thing. So as an industry, we're going to have to just be wise to this and responsive. And you just won't do it with the rules that we used to have.
And on that point, when you talk to the very top tier of the organisation, do they understand that this workforce has different demands, both technically, about the way they work, about what will entice them to join you full-time or as a contractor or any of those means? Does the board understand it yet?
This is just for us, right? This isn't...
Well, with cameras rolling and everything, yeah, just us.
Should keep it here, but from my experience, generally speaking, not right away. I guess that's a safe way to say it and not get fired. But I think it's because if we don't do a good job of really showcasing or really highlighting what the advantage and the benefit is to the board, the return on investment, the satisfied workforce, the ability to collaborate more effortlessly across an organization, I mean, those are real tangible benefits that I don't think we generally do a very good job of trying to sell up to the board.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. I think in the last sort of role and a half that I've had, I've spent 80% of my time with the board, educating the board, influencing the board, rather than actually managing my own team. And it's changed the dynamics of the type of team I need, because actually I need someone that does what I was hired to do in terms of run technology, whereas I'm a tech consultant now to bring the rest of my peers up to speed on the benefits and the pitfalls as well, because with this flexibility comes risk, and we need to understand our risk appetite to be able to agree our way forward.
I think there's a bit of a dichotomy at the top. So there's a lot of people who kind of get the importance of this, but then we end up with the people as cost debate going on at the top. You find a lot of non-exec directors who, like things like diversity, they kind of are completely bought into because they see the link to the sustainability of the organisation, the kind of ongoing survival. But I spend a lot of time coaching leadership teams and boards through these sorts of journeys. You know, at the end of the day, they're human beings as well, and they're scared. They don't know everything they need to know. And actually just, again, it's that these are big changes. How do we start taking the smaller steps forwards together and actually help them doing that as leadership teams or as board teams is really important, because quite often it's a bit of a, it's him over there, it's her over there sort of problem. Actually, you know, things like how we're going to operate in a more agile way as an organisation, well, that kind of requires all of us to start changing the way that we kind of create the environment in the organisation, the direction we set for the organisation, and frankly empowering a load of people to do some stuff differently. So it can't be that answer, it has to be us together stepping outside of our individual roles to do that.
I think it's important that we have those discussions, and we try not to talk too much about the tech, because it isn't really about that. It's about the impact on the people. And it isn't about, I think I've heard today, about cutting people costs, because you're not going to do that with automation. You're going to change their role. You're going to, you know, make things better, yes, but you're not going to reduce your cost base drastically. So I think it's having those conversations and influencing them to understand where they fit in. The CEO must lead this. It isn't down to the IT person to do it. You know, HR need to be involved. It has to be across the board.
One thing I've noticed is that you're seeing more CIOs, CTOs becoming non-exec directors, so they're bringing that sort of experience of having led business technology leadership roles. Is that helping? Is it having that person in a NED role helping those discussions, helping the board educate themselves so that they work more technically savvy with you?
I think it is helping. It's great that the role's finally been recognised. I think there's still a bit of work for UK PLC to allow their CIOs to go off and go and take that additional role or roles in different industries.
That's a two-way thing though, isn't it? That's progress from a board composition point of view. It's also progress from a CIO community point of view. I still participate in too many events where CIOs are there talking about their budgets and their technology and not talking about their products, their company, the business value, you know, all that kind of stuff. So I think you've got to see it from both sides of where does a board get its value from somebody who's on it, and you've got to, you know, we as a CIO community, we've got to be able to be shown to adding value back in.
And it's not boxes and wires, that's for sure.
Yeah, for sure.
And presumably these boards also need to talk about technology, not as in what you're operating, but what it's going to do to your organisation. We're all sitting around this table, we've all been in sectors or are in sectors that have been changed dramatically in the last decade by technology, by other businesses that never even were in our sector. Boards are beginning to sit down and get, let's just blue sky and think, you know, could Amazon or someone come along and take a percentage of our market?
So I think what's the role of the external ecosystem is both sort of threat and friend to most companies. And so actually what role are we going to play with other organisations outside of our own, and you know, where are we going to be the sort of the destination choice network or ecosystem versus where we're going to go and play a role in someone else's ecosystem. It's less binary. You know, we just have a vertically integrated business, and you know, off we go. We just distribute to customers. A lot of businesses face a set of choices about where do we want to play in the future. So we've got our kind of good core business that we know today. Actually, there's all these possibilities about where we might go and play, but they all carry slightly different risks. They carry slightly different relationships with the client or end customer. They carry different implications for where we kind of go and allocate investment. So those are some of the really big pivot choices at the top of the organisation about where we're going to go and play and who we're going to play with and with what role.
I think the only thing we've seen in addition to that is the investment isn't always financial. So actually for us it's access to our people in some of these startups, the fintech startups that we're working with, and access to our data. So it's great that we've moved away from a traditional, there's £5 to invest in a company. We're actually handing over our people and access to our own IP of data, which is giving these companies, the startup companies, fantastic access to items that they probably would never have got for another 5-10 years in their own evolution.
It's fascinating how, so we've made $4 billion worth of acquisitions over the last sort of 3-4 years. My father-in-law works in advertising. He phoned me up and went, "You guys are the world's biggest digital advertising agency." I was like, "Sorry, when did that happen?" It's like, didn't even know we did advertising. And then that's now kind of a core part of our business. We've had to kind of make sure those capabilities are protected and not kind of absorbed into the much bigger organisation, but it's also starting to influence the way that we've done our kind of traditional technology or consulting work with clients as well. So I think that kind of how that idea about flow of ideas and how you can influence each other's cultures is really, really interesting as well when you play with a wider group of partners.
I think it's hard for big corporates to make small acquisitions because it's too easy for us to kill the entity that you've bought from the cultural perspective, come into the big corporate machine and the collaboration tools won't work, and it takes 6 weeks to get a request through the system. And how do you keep that flexibility within the enterprise that you've bought, but yet integrate it? And I think we've got a lot to learn in that space.
And we've seen a lot of that in the tech industry, haven't we? And it's certainly stopped in the last 8 years, but I remember, the big vendors were always buying up small companies, and as you say, the culture got crushed a bit, but that seems to have stopped now, and actually the big companies now much prefer to partner and work much more collaboratively with their small providers, and from my observations it seems to be helping everyone.
I think an interesting development is the idea of that you can work with it, you'll get yourself familiar with the startup scene and actually find companies in your vertical who you can invest in and actually become investors in some of these companies to get capability or early access to capability rather than build it yourself. I think that's an interesting avenue that wasn't open to us years ago. When I was at Virgin Active, doing lots of work with health and fitness startups at Whitbread, lots of stuff with hotels, where you can find companies doing exactly what you're thinking about. And there's 10 people in a room, and that's what they're doing. They're sort of 2 years ahead of your thinking. So you don't have to buy them, but why not go and invest in them? Have preferential rates, all that kind of stuff. That's a really interesting place.
End of 2019, we're going into 2020. What do you think is going to be the change in the way organisations operate for the next decade? A new decade always feels like a time to think about the next change. When we're all sat here in 2029, still looking as young and fresh as we do now, how will your organisations look? How different will they be? I'll start with you, Jim.
That's a big question. I think for our organization, we have some very lofty revenue and profitability goals, and I think, God willing, we will hit those numbers, and I will be here in 2029. But I think that where we are right now and I'm focused on the collaboration part of all this, we have choices today, and we don't have a lot of interoperability, and we're still piecemealing all of these tools kind of together, not just from the collaboration tool, but also the equipment that goes with it, all the odds and ends for having, say, a conference in a conference room or whatever. From the technology side, I think we're going to see a much more savvy workforce who understands how to better collaborate, who understands more of the technology that's involved. But besides that, as I mentioned earlier, I think the technology is going to catch up to where we will have smart meeting rooms, we'll have way more smart buildings. You'll be able to walk into a room, the room will know who's there, they'll automatically book the room, automatically set the air conditioning to the temperature you like. There's a lot of that, I think, that we're going to see.
Smarter buildings and organisations, I like that, Andy.
Probably two things, so more human and more intelligent. So more human, back to the point about purpose. I think there's a massive gap in work at the moment, and the organisations are finding purpose and meaning in work have got a real winning edge. Responsible business and trust are obviously important topics for consumers, but also increasingly for the workforce as well. And then the topic of psychological safety at a team level. Can I have voice? Can I speak up? Can I share the half-formed idea? Can I be fully myself inside the team? I think that kind of a more human workplace. Accenture is very much on that journey. We've kind of been very, very deliberate about that and let that flourish inside the organisation. But I'd love to see that really blossom inside our organisation, actually in all our client organisations as well. And then the other side of it would be intelligent. So this idea about The technologies we're now working with, the idea that you can use data and machine learning and AI to create self-tuning parts of the organisation. So yes, we can be more agile organisations in the big leaps we make, but also at the edge of the organisation we can give much more personalised service to clients. We can be much more kind of edgy in what we provide in terms of propositions, and actually we can be more, back to the topic of ecosystems we talked about earlier, we can be more plug and play, not just in terms of APIs for technology, but APIs for businesses. We can build little micro enterprises inside the bigger business. So I'd love to see more human businesses and more intelligent businesses out there.
Interesting. Natascha?
I agree with that. I think 2 main points. I think there'll be less of the corporate office style. There will be a lot more freelancers. People will come in to do tasks or work on projects rather than work for that company. And I think the workplace will be more tailored towards the individual needs. It will be more focused on well-being and how can we make it work for working parents and people who are looking after the elderly. How can we, make that balance work? Because I don't think it's actually working that well at the moment. I think there are a lot of people who are facing mental health issues as a result of trying to juggle so much. So we have to respond to that.
Wonderful.
Well, we're really rubbish at predicting the future, aren't we, generally speaking? And I'm sort of thinking about that. Last night I watched a Premier League football game on a streaming service provided by a company I used to buy books and CDs from. So I'm just thinking, in 2007, would I have said that's where I would get my sports coverage? So I wouldn't have done that. So I think a decade's an enormous period of time. The bit that I'm really excited about, because I don't think there's ever been a more exciting time to be in technology, is how people will work. I was on a study tour in Silicon Valley a couple of months ago. 2 companies actually mentioned 2016 as being a date. They both said we're post-2016 companies, and I was intrigued by that. What do you mean by post-2016? They said, well, in San Francisco there's 100,000 open developer vacancies, it's $250,000 for a developer, so you just can't recruit people, and we do everything remotely. And the tools have now, they've sort of picked 2016 as the period the tools have got good enough for them. Using Zoom video and Slack and all the rest of those tools. I think today they're good enough. In 10 years' time they'll be better than face-to-face. I'm really intrigued. Today there is no doubt that the best way to get 5 people to work together is to put them around a table and together. That's really hard, and it's difficult and not flexible and doesn't bring everyone in. In 10 years' time, I'm intrigued by the fact I think it'll be better to work with the tools, because the tools we don't have today, there are tools that just don't exist today. The injection of all these things we've been talking about, AI, presence, awareness, all that kind of stuff, and a bit of a human element will mean actually it'll be better and more enjoyable to work in that environment than it does today, because it has to for us to succeed.
Brilliant. Last but not least.
Thank you. We get asked this question a lot in our industry at Experian. I think we look at it from a number of dimensions. Firstly, with the open everything type approach with the PSD2, open banking, the open energy companies now directive that's out. We see, the next technology change. We're about to see our biggest technology change ahead of us now with 5G coming in. 5G is going to open up so many more avenues. Amazon are exploiting it now with their Go stores. There are about 18 stores now. There's going to be 3,000 in the next 12 to 18 months. So what is that 5G technology going to bring with the latency speeds of connecting everything? Connected cars, connected shops. So the data aspect of that, we're struggling to predict, because the sheer volume is going to increase dramatically, and we're worried about how humans are going to be able to cope with that. They're not. So machine learning and AI in many different guises. So it's something that we look at literally week by week as to how we can actually look at the technologies coming into the market and try and exploit the avenues and opportunities it brings. But I do see the world becoming more open, which is going to be difficult for some of the regulated industries. And if the banking industry can do it, then the boundaries should be open for many other industries.
I think you're all raising fascinating points as well, because it's interesting how going to work, retail, shopping on a high street, and that are talked of like they're these long historic things. And actually, if you read in Elizabeth Gaskell, they were worrying about the high shop windows, was this transformation. It was terrifying. Oh, these horrible shop windows. And that's not that long ago, early 1800s, late 1700s, I believe that novel was written. But we've got it in our heads that it's been like this forever and a day. And actually, these are quite small periods of time that are now being disrupted by this disruptive workforce, by these technologies. And to your point earlier, actually they're not working for us anymore, are they? And so we're moving into a new way. And some of the old lessons, it would be interesting to see what from the past will re-emerge. And is eBay and Etsy and what have you actually just a re-emergence of the market, the traditional market that we once relied upon? Thank you all for your insights and sharing your views and how your organisations are both being disrupted and disruptive, and how your workforces are changing the way you deliver your services to your customers and to your internal organisation. It's been a fantastic conversation. Thank you for joining us. My name is Mark Chillingworth. This was The Studio.